Hello. In this video, I'm going to analyze and go over some of the most prominent ways in which Disco Elysium incentivizes the reader to close read. But first, some necessary background and definitions of terms. Disco Elysium is a 2019 CRPG developed by the Zaum Cultural Collective. A CRPG is an acronym that stands for Computer Role-Playing Game. Originally, the term was coined to classify a kind of computer game which adapted the tabletop role-playing game, like Dungeons & Dragons for example, to a computer medium. However, in recent decades, its meaning has changed. Nowadays, the term RPG is most commonly used to describe any rules-based narrative game, while the term CRPG denotes a specific kind of RPG. This is of relevance to my topic, since CRPGs are commonly defined as having a large overarching narrative, branching dialogue, a large amount of textual elements, and a focus on world building. The academic background for this video will be The Closeness of Close Reading by Jonathan Culler. Therefore, I will focus on the poetics of the textual elements shown here and how the mechanics interact with them. I will also be using Roland Barthes' concept of the work and the text. So when I refer to something as a textual element, I'm talking about poetics, and when I refer to something as text, I'm talking about it in terms of Barthes' work, except when quoting sources. My hypothesis is that Disco Elysium redesigns the traditional textual mechanics of CRPGs in intentionally ambiguous and disruptive ways in order to encourage a close reading approach to its textual elements, consequently realizing them as text. The first thing that is immediately noticeable by players of CRPGs that stands out about Disco Elysium's textual elements is the way they're formatted. CRPGs traditionally align their textual elements horizontally from one corner of the computer screen to the other. The developers of Disco Elysium found, as they explain in their art book, that they were exhausting their players with a seemingly endless torrent of text. Their explicit goal was to get players focused on the textual elements, to keep them attentive to them as much as possible. Their solution was to format the textual elements vertically in bite-sized paragraphs. They mentioned how they got this idea from a certain multi-billion-dollar social networking service in constant development by a multinational conglomerate that had already spent astronomical sums of money becoming the best interface for handling and presenting exorbitant amounts of text. Obviously, they are referring to Twitter, now called X, but due to their dislike of said conglomerates, they refused to give them explicit credit in the art book. After deliberating on the layout of the textual elements for some time, they concluded that when our writers began formatting the text as bite-sized, easy-to-read paragraphs, we finally saw we were onto something. The fertile VC-watered soil of Silicon Valley did not disappoint. Now, attentive reading or focused reading is not close reading. Close reading encompasses more specific methodologies. However, an above-average focus or attention to textual elements is an integral part of any definition of close reading, and it was Zaum's intention to promote the specific kind of attentiveness to textual elements in the player. To summarize, an attribute system in a CRPG is a set of attributes expressed in numerical values that can be adjusted by the player, which open up the possibility of doing certain actions or for a higher chance of success when attempting certain actions. Most of them are based on the classic attributes defined by Dungeons & Dragons: strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, and charisma. Even to someone who has never encountered them before, they appear self-explanatory. For example, if you have a high dexterity attribute, you may be able to run away from a hotel clerk without paying your bill. In dialogue, these attributes are also relevant. I will get to this later. These attributes are also followed by brief descriptions of what they mean in the context of the game and what they can hypothetically help the player to achieve if they are high enough. However, players don't usually read these descriptions. They look at the attributes, recognize them, and start planning which to increase, and so on and so on. A clear example of scanning. Disco Elysium subverts these expectations and encourages players to spend time reading and pondering over the attributes by making them not only unfamiliar, but ambiguous. Firstly, instead of the more common 5 attributes, there are 24 spread out over 4 general groups. Looking at the character creation screen, we see attributes with names such as Shivers, Inland Empire, Drama, Interfacing, Esprit de Corps, and so on. Very unusual names for what are supposed to be general attributes, and the descriptions are not very helpful in clarifying their function. Only very far into the game will the player-reader actually get some idea of what these attributes are and how they function. Even then, the meaning and function of these attributes probably won't be completely understood. This ambiguous quality of specific textual elements, as Culler explains in his article on close reading, is one of the main traits scholars point out when discussing close reading. Whether the aim is to clear up the ambiguity, expose it, or contextualize it depends on the particular definition of close reading. Nonetheless, it is a core characteristic of the method of close reading for most scholars. Branching dialogue is a defining mechanic of CRPGs. It generally falls into two categories: non-attribute dependent dialogue and attribute dependent dialogue. Non-attribute dependent dialogue is one that can be freely accessed when encountered. Attribute dependent dialogue is one that can only be engaged in if an attribute check is passed. That is, if an attribute is high enough. Disco Elysium uses the same system for its dialogue, but with significant modifications and additions. The game is almost completely voiced, and along with having the standard branching dialogue mechanic, it has a narrated inner monologue mechanic. Inner monologue is rare in CRPGs, despite their heavy use of textual elements, and branching inner monologue is even rarer. This is where the attributes come into play again. Every attribute in the game is its own distinct inner voice. The fragmented psyche of the main character is expressed through a Bakhtian polyphony, except the distinctive voices are all internal and part of one character. They communicate with the main character as if he were a separate entity and communicate amongst themselves. This further raises the ambiguity and certainty of the textual elements. We can never be sure of the trustworthiness of these narrators or of the reality they describe. The binary of the inner and the outer voice no longer holds. Not only that, but the inner voice has become multiple inner voices, and despite almost all the dialogue and monologue in Disco Elysium being voiced, the main character's outer voice, his speaking voice, is not. An interesting development: that which is usually silent becomes many-voiced. That which is voiced by definition becomes silent. Some scholars have written academic articles focusing on the text of just one of these attributes. Disco Elysium also incorporates sound and animation into its presentation of textual elements in an interesting way. Along with voice acting, the environmental sounds or actions of characters will be represented by textual elements and sound.
Yes. Yes.
This gives the textual elements an additional layer of performance to go with the voice acting. Moving further from a synchronized audiobook, a format voice-acted CRPGs are sometimes compared to, and more towards a kind of radio drama. An even more interesting innovation to the flow of textual elements in the game is how it applies anticipation to the textual elements. Every time an attribute check is performed, there are a few seconds of anticipation where the reader can hear a roll of tape reel in the background, and the screen will flash green or red depending on whether the check was successful or not. This cannot be avoided. It is integral to the dialogue and attribute check systems in the game. This anticipation will either increase the interest of an already attentive reader or stop the fast scansion of a textually disengaged reader. Usually, the point of branching dialogue in CRPGs is that it leads to new information or different endings to the conversations. Part of why it is called branching dialogue is because it branches out in different directions. But in Disco Elysium, there is a kind of branching dialogue that branches back in on itself, and the information it offers appears insignificant at first. For example, while the main character is examining a stained glass portrait of a famous historical figure in the world of Disco Elysium, arguably the most famous historical figure, the dialogue branches out into two directions and immediately branches back in. Before I continue, let's listen to these two paragraphs side by side. The first one:
in white, silver, and apricot faience, the young mother of humanism stands above you. A crack runs across her body. She is impossibly tall, oval-faced and sad, a dark and radiant majesty.
And now the second one.
There she still stands, in white, silver, and apricot, the young mother of humankind. A crack runs across her body. She is impossibly tall, oval-faced and sad, a dark and radiant majesty.
The minimal differences between these two paragraphs will lead the reader to question what the point of them was. Why was it necessary to change or add a few words and make this paragraph into two branching paragraphs? Even asking this question, the player-reader is engaging in a kind of close reading. In fact, the question could be interpreted both in terms of poetics and hermeneutics. For example, Though the words have obvious common ground, there is a difference between being the mother of humanism or the mother of humankind. Without resorting to symptomatic reading, purely on a philological level, this difference is interesting. The more a reader thinks about it, the more this difference becomes significant. I have not found a generally accepted name for this kind of literary device which creates a juxtaposition between two concepts or textual elements through this dialogue branching mechanic. So for this video, I will simply call it branching juxtaposition, a kind of juxtaposition which is easily applicable when constructing the poetics of texts in games. And in Disco Elysium, these branching juxtapositions are common and no doubt meant to stimulate a closer reading of the textual elements. There also seems to be a complication of Barth's work-text binary here. The characteristics of the text remain the same, but the work from which it can be actualized do not. The work is no longer seamless but fragmented. There is no way to read both of the branching paragraphs in a single playthrough. The player would have to go through the sequence again to see the other option. Therefore, the game encourages skepticism towards the work and motivates players' readers to reread it and actively look for text. Also, new literary devices like these and those previously mentioned could necessitate new methods and provide development to the practice of close reading. Even though I could go on for another hour at least, this video has to end at a reasonable time, and so thank you for your time and have a pleasant day.